So one of the things I love about Abolition Now is it's one of the only conferences I can think of where a speaker can step up to the podium completely sunburned from the day of evangelism before. So my lips are completely fried, but I will try to speak as clearly as I can for you guys. So my topic today is the equal protection mandate and the sin of Dobbs. So when we talk about equal protection, what we're talking about is the idea that governing officials have a mandate from God and from the U.S. Constitution to treat preborn children equally by law. Now, what that does mean is that the killing of a preborn child must be treated in the same way as the killing as any other person. What it does not mean is that every actor in an abortion must be treated in the same way. Of course, the facts of each case must be taken into account by prosecutors, by judges, by juries, and all of that. So Bradley has a longer talk, Abortion and Justice Under the Law, if you want a rundown of every little detail of what this means. But in short, we're just talking about equality under the law for preborn children. Now, the pro-life position on equal protection, as stated in the open letter that many of you know about from the 76 leading pro-life organizations, their position is the mother who aborts her child is also Roe's victim. She is the victim of a callous industry created to take lives, an industry that claims to provide for women's health, but denies the reality that far too many American women suffer devastating physical and psychological damage following abortion. Turning women who have abortion into criminals is not the way. So in the view of the pro-life leaders, every aborting mother is a victim. In the view of the pro-life leaders, the act of paying somebody to rip apart your baby in the womb is to put victim status on yourself. The act of taking a pill to murder a preborn child is to make yourself into a victim, according to the pro-life leaders. So that is their position. So let's go through from Scripture and from the U.S. Constitution, and let's see who's right. So let's go through 3 biblical principles regarding the equal protection mandate. First one being show no partiality. So impartiality is defined as unprejudiced, unbiased, treating all alike. That is to say, equal protection. Everyone should be treated equally before the law. Let's look at a couple passages. Deuteronomy 1:17. Do not show partiality in judging. Here both small and great alike, do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Now this is from the ESV, and most translations translate it along these lines. But the most literal translation of the first part of that sentence there is, do not discern faces in judgment. Do not look at the face of the person you're judging, of the accused or of the accuser, but look at the conduct. Judge conduct. Is the person guilty or not guilty? Do not discern their face. There's things about their face that may sway you, right? They may be very influential, and you are liable to be swayed by influence. They may be very poor and pitiable, and you may be liable to be swayed by that sort of thing. But do not judge their face. Do not discern their face in your judgment. Discern their conduct. Now, the pro-life leaders say the opposite. They say, no, forget the conduct. Forget that they just took a pill to murder a baby. Look at the face of this woman. This is a woman, for goodness sakes. You're talking about criminalizing women? What are you, some kind of bloodthirsty misogynist trying to criminalize all the women out there? Discern her face, is what the pro-life leaders say. But God's word tells us, do not discern faces in judgment. Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Again, we are not partial towards anyone, towards whether their influence is liable to sway us by virtue of it being so high or being so low. We are not to discern faces, we are to discern conduct and to judge righteously. One more passage, Deuteronomy 16:18-20. You shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial. Justice and only justice you shall pursue. Show no partiality. But you might say, well, okay, show no partiality, but there are legitimate differences between abortion and murder. A pro-lifer might say, there's differences involved in this case. Well, what does God's word say about that? Let's go to Exodus 21. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This is God clearly telling us there is no difference between abortion and murder. To whatever degree you harm a child in the womb, legally, that harm is to be returned to you by the civil magistrate, who should judge unrighteously and not discern your face, but judge your conduct. There is no difference between murder and abortion. Abortion is simply a way of saying prenatal murder. All right, third biblical principle, love your preborn neighbor as yourself. Let's go Matthew 22. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Back to Matthew 7. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, there's an obvious point that can be drawn out here, in that you cannot love your preborn neighbor as yourself while calling for them to get a lesser degree of justice or a lesser degree of protection than you yourself enjoy. That's clearly a violation of these principles. But one other point that I want to draw out here is regarding the nature of the law. What can we discern about the nature of the law from these passages? If you look at the ending of each of these passages, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. What commandments? Love God, love neighbor. And whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. And so we have a lot of kind of mostly antinomian and R2K type people who go around saying, no, don't preach the law, don't preach the law. But when they're saying that, what are they saying based on these passages? They're saying, don't preach love, right? The law is love. The law is attached to the character of God inextricably. You can't detach the two. To love God is to love his law, which is an outflowing of his character. And so when the pro-life leaders say, oh, you're acting hatefully toward women, you're acting discriminatorily or harshly or unloving or you're uncompassionate towards women, no. The law is love. You shall outlaw murder. You shall not murder is love. Rescue those being led to slaughter, love. Right? All of these things is to love your preborn neighbor as yourself. And the pro-life movement has it completely twisted. I'm going to come back to this later because it's really, really important. But the pro-life movement has love completely flipped on its head. And so those are the three biblical principles. We've got show no partiality, prenatal impartiality, and love your preborn neighbor as yourself. All right, let's get into some legal stuff. The equal protection mandate in the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment says, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And so this clause raises the question, who is a person? Abolitionists, and to their credit, a handful of pro-lifers, say that all human beings are people. All human beings are persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment. All human beings get equal protection under the law. However, abortion supporters and the vast majority of pro-lifers do not agree. Here's a quote. I will tell you who it is afterward. I think when the Constitution says that persons are entitled to equal protection of the laws, I think it clearly means walking around persons. Now, you might think that is from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. No, this is Antonin Scalia. All right, this is one of the preeminent conservative, pro-life legal scholars of the previous generation. And he believes that the Constitution, when it says person, is clearly referring to walking around persons, and the vast majority of the pro-life leaders agree with him. Let's see who's right. In order to discern who's right on this, what we have to do is we have to see what did the word person mean when it was written into the United States Constitution, which was 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified. So let's go to law dictionaries of the time. A New Law Dictionary and Glossary from 1851 defined person as a human being considered as the subject of rights, as distinguished from a thing. So we have things and inanimate objects, and we have human beings, and this category over here are persons, right, according to this law dictionary. The Law Dictionary 1836 defined person as a man or woman. Noah Webster's American Dictionary from 64 said a living human being, a man, woman, or child, an individual of the human race. William Blackstone, who was one of the most influential legal scholars and philosophers who influenced the common law, which became later American law, or the foundation of American law in the colonies in the early states, he said, natural persons are such as the God of nature formed us. So what do we have in all of these definitions, or more precisely, what do we not have? We do not have any reference to the status of being born or of walking around as qualifying someone for being a person, right? We have humanity. We have person being used as a synonym for human being. Let's see how the Supreme Court itself defined person prior to Roe versus Wade. In the 1818 case, United States v. Palmer, they ruled, person includes, quote, every human being, unquote, and, quote, the whole human race, unquote. Seems pretty clear. Let's go forward 120 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. The history of the 14th Amendment proves that the people were told that its purpose was to protect weak and helpless human beings. Does that bring anyone to mind in our context? Weak and helpless human beings. Let's look at how the author of the 14th Amendment himself defined the word person. So this is John Bingham. He was a congressman from Ohio, and during a debate on the floor of Congress over the 14th Amendment, he said, if a state has not the right to deny equal protection to any human being. Now, if you remember back to the phrasing of the 14th Amendment, equal protection is given to persons, but here he says human being. He's using it completely interchangeably with person. To any human being under the Constitution of this country in the rights of life, liberty, and property, how can state rights be impaired by penal prohibitions of such denials as proposed? In another presentation in his home state, Ohio, in Bowerstown, he said, no state in the Union should deny to any human being the equal protection of the laws. Again, to Bingham, human being and person were synonymous. They were two ways of saying the same thing, or at least that person included, certainly, any human being. Let's look to other states at the time that the amendment was ratified. In 30 of, at the time, 37 United States states, 30 of them classified abortion as, quote, an offense against the person. That was the category of law that abortion prohibitions were housed under. Offenses against the person. Clearly, the vast majority of the United States at the time of ratification considered preborn children to be persons. 23 of the 37 classified preborn humans as a child. Child was the designated term to include preborn human beings in the laws of 23 states at the time that the amendment was ratified. Back to Bingham's home state of Ohio. So on January 11th, 1867, the Ohio State Senate ratified the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution by an overwhelming vote. Now, 3 weeks later, on February 1st of 1867, there was a bill to completely outlaw abortion in Ohio that went to a select subcommittee in the Ohio State Senate. There were 3 senators on that subcommittee: L.D. Griswold, Tolan Jones, and Henry West. Now, when a subcommittee refers a bill to the floor of the whole Senate, they can give a literal report along with the bill if they want to. And what these 3 senators wrote in the report was, physicians have now arrived at the unanimous opinion that the fetus in utero is alive from the very moment of conception. In all of our cities and in many of our villages, there is a class of quacks who make child murder a trade. Let it be proclaimed to the world, and let it be impressed upon the conscience of every woman in the land that the willful killing of a human being at any stage of its existence is murder. Now, 2 of these 3, L.D. Griswold and Tolan Jones, voted in favor of ratifying the 14th Amendment. Henry West abstained. He did not vote. So these are the same people who are voting to ratify the 14th Amendment, who are calling abortion murder, the killing of a human being, and child murder. Right? Very clearly, the people ratifying the 14th Amendment, the vast majority of them at least, believe preborn children to be people. So again, when we see the word person right there in the 14th Amendment, there will be certainly all pro-aborts, and the vast majority of pro-lifers will say, well, no, person, that's walking around persons. That's people, who have sentience or whatever addition that they want to add to humanity that qualifies us to be persons. But this is not at all what the historical record tells us about the 14th Amendment. Now, again, I'm giving a brief presentation going through a lot of stuff here. If you want to do a really deep dive on this, and it is a very important subject to be making this case, and we'll get to that, or to why that is in the next section here. If you want to do a deep dive, here's two things that you can read, two papers that have been written by some historical and legal scholars. Re-Examining Roe, 19th Century Abortion Statutes in the 14th Amendment by James S. Witherspoon, and Protecting Prenatal Persons, Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion by Josh Craddock. Now, when I recommend these, I do want to add a caveat, because while these two papers have done really tremendous work in the area of history and digging up, just hundreds, possibly even thousands of 19th century abortion statutes, really, really impressive work demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that person includes all human beings. But I have to add the caveat that while their research is really, really good and proves beyond any reasonable doubt what they're trying to prove, some of their conclusions are not what I would endorse completely. And let me explain what I mean by that, just for anyone reading it. So when we say equal protection, I explained what we mean by that, but there is a slightly different version of equal protection that is being advocated right now by a lot of people. And most recently, Live Action, who to their credit was not on the open letter of the 76 pro-life groups, which was good to see. So I'm wondering, okay, is Live Action maybe coming around on equal protection? But recently, Live Action sent out a letter explaining their definition of equal protection. And what they mean by it is they mean equal protection must be afforded to the preborn child. However, equal protection does not necessitate equal available penalties. And this idea is kind of best captured in an article in National Review. This is from Robert George and John Finnis. They write, equal protection of the laws does not require uniformity of treatment, but absence of distinctions lacking a rationally sufficient basis. So basically what they're saying is the penalty for abortion can be substantially lower than, than that of murder, but there must be a rationally sufficient basis for doing so. Rationally sufficient basis. Now, to prove that rationally sufficient basis, they may point to different mitigating factors involved in an abortion, right? This woman was, she was under duress, or, she was about to be kicked out of the house, or whatever the facts of the case be, this provides the rationally sufficient basis for making abortion a lesser category of crime. But the problem with this is that there is no mitigating factor necessarily present in every abortion that makes it categorically a less crime than murder. Right? If there are differences in a case-by-case basis, if some women are coerced, under duress, for whatever reason, don't have criminal intent, but they did it, that's for prosecutors, judges, juries to consider. That is not for legislators to consider. Legislators must write laws providing equal protection of the law to all human beings, to all people. There is no rationally sufficient basis to make abortion a lesser crime than homicide. And so the work that both George and John Finnis and Craddock and Witherspoon have done is really, really good, but there is a distinction in a little bit of what they mean by equal protection. So I just wanted to nuance that out, because especially with the Live Action letter, I think this view might be gaining a little bit of traction among some of the pro-life groups who are a bit closer to us, but they don't mean quite the same thing when they use the word equal protection. So I did want to address that. All right, before we get into our final section of the presentation here, I want to read a passage from Matthew, and maybe the connections will start to form in your mind as we go here. Matthew 27, verse 24. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water, washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be upon us and on our children. Then Pilate released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So keep that in mind as we go. All right, let's talk about Dobbs v. Jackson. All right, this is the big Supreme Court case. Roe was overturned between the last Abolition Now conference and this one. And so let's dive into what that means, the good and the bad, and everything involved with Dobbs v. Jackson. So here was the central holding of Dobbs. Roe and Casey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and to their elected representatives. So let's first address the good. This takes away an excuse. All right, those of you who've been up to capitals talking to your legislator or others about supporting an abolition bill, you likely ran into two excuses prior to the overturn of Roe. First one being equal protection, which we've talked about earlier. The other one being, we can't pass this bill, we can't abolish abortion because the Supreme Court said we can't. So the overturning of Roe, it does take away that excuse. That's a helpful thing. That's a good thing that we can acknowledge as a good thing. The other thing we can point to is it is indicative of cultural and political progress. So imagine that there is a white sheet that is stretched out and it's held taut around the edges. Now imagine there's some small marbles at different places around this white sheet. Then imagine you take a giant steel ball and you drop it right in the middle of that sheet. What's going to happen to those marbles? Right, they're going to be drawn inward toward the middle. They're going to be drawn inward toward that steel ball. Now in the analogy, that steel ball is the truth. All right, that steel ball is that life begins at conception. Excuse me, and abortion must be abolished. And so the marbles, in one form of this analogy, are the different pro-life groups. And so those of you, especially who've been in this as long as Russell and some others of you in this room have, you'll have seen the pro-life groups over time become more and more biblically consistent. Right? A few years ago, all the big pro-life groups were opposing heartbeat bills. You wouldn't have seen barely anything about Christianity on any of these groups' websites. And over time, as the abolitionist movement has gained steam, you can acknowledge these pro-life groups. They're starting to respond to our influence by becoming more like us. They're starting to respond to our influence by using our arguments, by using our language in different ways. They're coming closer and closer because we're pulling the whole sheet down by powerfully, boldly proclaiming the truth, and they're being forced to move closer and closer to us. Now, they're not where they need to be. I don't think there's any, at least major pro-life groups, who have moved to where they need to be yet, but we can acknowledge it's a good thing when the pro-life groups are moving closer and closer. However, we can't endorse them where they are. We can't say that this is a good organization until they're all the way in the middle. Now, in the same way, I think we can acknowledge that there's a piece of that that's at work in the Dobbs decision. I think that there were 38 abortion-related cases between 1973, when Roe was first decided, and 2022, when it was overturned. The Supreme Court had 38 abortion-related cases, many of which provided an obvious opportunity to overturn Roe. And what happened? Right? 0 for 38. They upheld Roe all 38 times. Now, on the 39th time, we had abolition bills starting to get hearings. We had abolition bills with hundreds and sometimes thousands of ralliers. On the 39th time, we had an abolitionist amicus brief submitted in the case, authored by Bradley Pierce and co-submitted by a number of other organizations, saying either you do your job or we're going to do it without you. Now, is it possible that it was a coincidence that 39th time, with the abolitionist movement doing what it was doing, that's the time that Roe was overturned? Is it possible that that's a coincidence? Maybe. I don't think so. I don't think it's very likely that is a coincidence. I think we're changing the political landscape. We always pushed for abolition bills and ignoring Roe and all of that. I always thought it was probably going to be that once we were getting close, the Supreme Court was going to get out in front of it. Because obviously that would be quite an embarrassment if we were to actually do it. If we were to actually abolish abortion in defiance of the Supreme Court, that would be quite a lot of egg on their face. And so I think what happened, or at least an aspect that was in play there, was them trying to get out in front of that. And so we can acknowledge that it's a good thing that the court is having to move closer and closer towards us. Right? They overturned Roe. They said there's no constitutional right to an abortion. However, the court is not where it needs to be. So while we can acknowledge it's good, the political landscape's moving, they're having to respond to it, they are not where they need to be. And let's talk about why that is. So this first quote here is a quote from Samuel Alito's majority opinion, so writing for the majority in the decision. He says, "Our opinion is not based on any view about if and when prenatal life is entitled to any of the rights enjoyed after birth." So all that stuff that I went through about the meaning of the word person and the fact that life begins at conception, person includes all human beings. He's saying our opinion is not based on any view regarding that question. Then I'll read you another quote from Brett Kavanaugh's concurrent in the opinion. He writes, "The issue before the court is what the Constitution says about abortion. The Constitution does not take sides on the issue of abortion. The text of the Constitution does not refer to or encompass abortion. On the question of abortion, the Constitution is therefore neither pro-life nor pro-choice. The Constitution is neutral. So, he's saying, because the Constitution is neutral, therefore, states, Congress, President, do as you will. Right? It's not, we can't do anything about abortion, but you all do as you will. Now, the problem here, those of you who are familiar with presuppositional apologetics will know what false neutrality is, right? So Brett Kavanaugh, and to a lesser degree, but also Samuel Alito, is claiming neutrality on the question of whether or not the preborn child is a person. Now, the problem with that is there a truly neutral position on the question? No, the preborn child is either a person or they are not. To say that we are going to remain neutral is to positively assert that the preborn child is not a person, because if they're a person, then their equal rights and protection must be granted. If they're a person, those rights must be granted. So the only way to not provide those rights is to positively assert that they are not a person. And that is what the court did in Dobbs. So let's go back to the passage and let's kind of readjust it for what we have in the Dobbs decision. So when Brett Kavanaugh saw that abolitionist pressure was building, he took water and he washed his hands before the nation, saying, I am innocent of the blood of preborn children. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, their blood be upon us and on our children. And then SCOTUS released for them California, New York, and Kansas, and delivered preborn children to be murdered. This is what Dobbs did. So while we can acknowledge, right, it's true. It takes away an excuse. That makes our job at legislatures easier in some way. We can acknowledge it's the court moving a little bit in the right direction. We can acknowledge that and even to a degree celebrate that, but we cannot say that this was a good decision. This was a profoundly, profoundly evil Supreme Court decision. So, in summary, there is an equal protection mandate in Scripture as demonstrated by God's clear prohibitions of partiality, as demonstrated by God's clear mandate that preborn children are equal and should be given equal protection, and as mandated in the second greatest commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's also clear from the Constitution, from the study of the dictionary definitions of person at the time, from the usage of person and human being at the time of the guy who wrote the 14th Amendment, and from the language in the different state constitutions and laws of the time. It is very clear that there is an equal protection mandate for every single governing official in Kansas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Texas, and every other state in the Union. It is also very clear that Dobbs violated that mandate. It pretended to be neutral, but it positively asserted that the preborn child is not a person. It is also clear that the pro-life leaders violate this mandate by their senseless proposition that to murder your baby is to become a victim. Now, there is an equal protection mandate, but an equal protection mandate is an idea. It's a command. It's not physical. It doesn't enforce itself, right? We are the church. We have to be a prophetic voice against the Supreme Court, against the pro-life leaders, demanding that this equal protection mandate be enforced. And it is my prayer that we're able to overcome their misinformation on this, because there are a lot, right? I mean, it's very encouraging to be with you all, to be marching down the streets of Wichita, by the hundreds. This has been a really, really good, invigorating week, right? But these pro-life groups are very influential, right? And the pro-life politicians here in Kansas and in Oklahoma, it's going to take a lot more than 300 of us, and it's going to take a lot more than 3-4 days of activism and teaching, right? It's going to take a lot of commitment in order to overcome the opposition that seeks to deny the equal protection mandate. And so we've got to be that voice. We've got to be that prophetic voice demanding the abolition of abortion as murder and demanding equal protection for our preborn neighbors. Thank you guys very much.